Hey guys, these are 10 mixing tips that actually changed my life. Now, this isn't just a video with miscellaneous mixing tips like how to make your snare bigger or how to make your synth lead really wide. That's not going to make you good at mixing. The only way to get good at mixing is to practice and train your ears, and this takes time. This is also what I designed this video to help you do. So in this video, I put together 10 tips that will teach you how you can learn mixing and train your ears yourself both quickly and effectively. These exact tips were an integral part in helping me learn mixing and also launch a successful career in music production. And I guarantee that if you apply any of these tips that you're going to see in these videos, that you will see a significant improvement in your mixes. Tip number 1 is to know the 3 dimensions of a mix. The 3 dimensions of a mix are the tall, deep, and wide dimensions. The tall dimension refers to a sound's position in a frequency spectrum. For example, you might have your kick and bass down in the sub-bass region. The chords satisfy the midsection of the mix, and then you have your vocals satisfying the high range, and then your drums will fill up the rest of the frequency spectrum. The wide dimension of a mix is how narrow, wide, or panned a sound is. When you're mixing, make sure you have a good variety of narrow sounds, wide sounds, not so wide sounds, and panned sounds. This will create a dynamic and satisfying stereo field. If you have a mix like this where everything is similar in width and you don't create a big stereo presence, your mix is not going to be that satisfying. The final dimension of a mix that you have to pay a lot of mind to is the depth of the mix. The depth of a sound is determined by how much or how little reverb and delay is on that sound. Sounds with a lot of reverb sound like they're farther away from the listener. Sounds with a little bit of reverb sound like they're very close to the listener. To create a mix with a lot of depth, you want a good contrast of sounds that are very close to the listener and sounds that are very far from the listener. And you should get a really big and powerful sound. This next tip is to EQ your reverb. Problem with reverb is that it's one of the messiest sounds in a mix. It's both really wide and it's also a full frequency spectrum sound. Check this out. I have a snare here. It sounds like this. For demonstration purposes, I'm going to add a reverb plugin of choice to this snare, and I'm going to put the mix all the way up so we're just getting the reverb signal. Now, if we look at our stereo imager and our EQ, and we play the snare back, we can see that the reverb is adding a really wide presence to the snare, and it's also emitting a lot of low frequency information. If you don't EQ the low end information out of your reverb can take up too much headroom, and the result of this is your song will sound softer or not as loud as a commercial mix. And the way you do this is you locate the EQ module on your reverb plugin of choice. Every reverb plugin has an EQ module. What you want to do is you want to find where it says low cut and then just remove all of the reverb information below 450 to 500 hertz, because below that, reverb has no business in a mix. So again, EQ your reverbs. This next tip is to manage your reverb so you can use your reverb to create depth and not mud. Remember that reverb is a big sound. Another issue I see is that a lot of us are using too many different reverb settings and plugins on the same track. When we're writing songs, it's very easy to load up an instrument and then slap reverb on that instrument to make it sound good. The problem is that every time you add reverb to an instrument, it competes or takes away from the reverb on another instrument. And when you have a lot of instruments with too many different reverb settings on them, all the reverbs will compete with each other and the mix will lack depth. Reverb is very delicate, so when you're adding reverb, I recommend limiting yourself to 2 to 3 reverb settings to use on all of the instruments in the song. Here's a visual example. On my drums and chords, I might have a small room reverb with a small amount of mix. And then on my vocals, I might have a large room reverb with a small amount of mix, similar to the mix on the drums and the chords. Because the vocals, drums, and chords have a small amount of mix, they're going to sound like they're really close to the listener. And to create depth, on my Atmos, I'm going to have a large room reverb with a large amount of mix. This is going to put the Atmos really far away from the listener, and because I only have a couple reverb settings for my ears to compare to, the reverbs won't clash, and they'll do what they're supposed to do, which is create a good contrasting depth of field. This next tip is to start a freelance mixing business. Now, I know it sounds weird, because if you're watching this video, you're probably newer at mixing songs, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to start charging for a mixing service. But you can start mixing for people for free, and then as your skills develop, you can begin to charge for your service. This is exactly what I did to both learn mixing and then build a freelance mixing business to almost 10 grand a month. And it was that kind of money that allowed me to quit my job in the automotive industry and then focus on music production full time. And trust me when I say this, when you can do music production full time, that's when you really get good at it, because it's all that you do. Now, how do you start practicing on people for free and then convert them into paying customers? What I did is I made a bunch of YouTube and Instagram content that attracted rappers and singers to my page. There is an endless sea of rappers and singers that want to sound like Drake and Taylor Swift, but they have no idea how to make themselves sound that way. And that is where you come in. I would offer to mix their music and their vocals for free, and in exchange, if they liked the service, they would have to send me a video testimonial or a good review, and then I would send them back the mixed stems. In the beginning, when I was terrible, nobody sent me good reviews or video testimonials, but I still got the practice. Over time, I kept doing this every single day. And as my mixes got better, I would begin getting more and more video testimonials and good reviews. And I took all of those reviews and plastered them all over a website. Eventually, I had all these testimonials and proof that I knew how to mix a song. So that's when I launched my paid mixing service. Most of the people that I was mixing for free for left, but some of them stuck around and began paying me to mix their songs. I kept making content and running deals and sending as many people to that webpage as I could. And over time, this took me about 2.5 to 3 years, I was able to build a lucrative list of mixing clients. Next tip, a mixing engineer is only as good as their mixing environment. This tip was critical to me when I was in my mixing prime, mixing 2 to 3 songs a day, because all the songs had to be done right and on time. And if you want to mix music as good as you possibly can, I highly recommend getting a set of studio monitors, a set of headphones, and some acoustic foam. You don't need the best studio monitors either, but studio monitors provide a better representation of audio than headphones do. And I make this comparison because a lot of at-home producers rely on headphones to mix their songs. So if you rely on headphones, you need to understand this. Because headphones are so close to your head, they're really good for hearing micro details in a mix, like cracks, pops, dirt, and microphasing issues. Studio monitors are better for hearing macro details like overall mix balance, stereo field dynamics, and bass balance. So when you put these two forces together, like studio monitors and headphones, you can hear everything and you will be an absolute unit at mixing songs. And don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean that you can't get a good mix on headphones. It just means that it's going to be a little harder for you than if you had headphones and a set of studio monitors. So yeah, at the bare minimum, if you want to hear everything and mix really well, you need a set of studio monitors, acoustic foam, and headphones. Now, if you don't want to listen to me and you want to keep relying on just headphones to mix your songs, listen to this next tip because it might help you. This next tip is to have multiple points of reference when mixing. Did you ever mix a song and then listen to it in your car and wonder why the song sounded so good when you were mixing it in your studio, but when you listen to it in your car, it sounds like trash? This is probably because you're not mixing with enough points of reference. When mixing, you should have at least 2 points of reference at all times. If you have a set of studio monitors, you should have another set of studio monitors to bounce back and forth between, or a set of studio monitors and a set of headphones to bounce back and forth between. If you only have headphones and you don't want studio monitors or can't get studio monitors for whatever reason, you should at least have another pair of headphones that you can bounce back and forth between during your mixing process. Bouncing back and forth between speaker systems during your mix down will help ensure that your mix translates to other speaker systems. And it's a lot better to find those translation issues while you're in the studio rather than finding out your song doesn't translate when you debut it at a show or when you're in a car and you want to show your song to your friends. This next tip is called the Magic High Pass Filter. I learned this tip from Grammy engineers Phil Tan and Roger Nichols. And what the Magic High Pass Filter sets you up to do is protect the kick and bass. So before I show you what it is, let me explain. The sub-bass frequencies are the most important frequencies in a mix because it's the foundation of your mix. If you can protect those sub-bass frequencies, your mix will sit on that sub-bass foundation and it will sound massive. So the way you can protect your sub bass and kick is you go to every single instrument except the kick and bass and sometimes snare, and you add an EQ and then create a high pass filter curve with that EQ and just cut out all the frequencies up to around 120 to 140 hertz. Anything below this, unless we're talking about the kick and bass, are doing nothing for the mix at all. They have no business being down there and they do nothing to help the mix sound good or big or clean. So what we do is we cut it out. If we look at an instrument like a vocal is a higher pitched instrument. We wouldn't think that it has a bunch of low frequency information seeping into the sub bass. And here's the thing, sometimes you don't even hear this low frequency information, and that's even more dangerous because if you can't hear it, you're not as likely to cut it out. The problem is we have so many instruments in our songs, especially if you're in a genre like pop music, electronic, or hip-hop where we use a lot of samples and layers. Most of these samples and layers are going to have that low frequency hidden information that disturbs the sub bass. That it all builds up, and that low frequency information will take up headroom and also create mud in your sub bass. This next tip really helped me develop my ears for mixing, and that is to understand why you should practice mixing in mono. The concept of mixing in mono is way over mentioned and way underexplained, and I'm going to try to explain it as best as I can because I think it's very useful. Mixing is about how well you set yourself up to hear sound, and part of setting yourself up to hear sound as best as you can is to eliminate things that skew your ability to judge what you're actually hearing. Wide sounds seem louder to us than they actually are. For example, I have this bass line here. I'm going to play it back in mono. Here's the same bass line played back wide, or not in mono. Wide sounds just sound bigger, and we associate that word big with louder. Now here's what's interesting. When a sound is playing back in mono, the sound is playing back in the phantom area of the stereo image, or in other words, right in front of you. When sounds are directly in front of you and they don't have any information leaking wide into the stereo image, you'll be able to make your best judgments regarding how loud or how quiet to make that sound in the mix. Balancing in mono isn't going to fix every balancing issue you have, but I think it's a really good idea to at least reference your mix in mono and attempt to balance it that way. So real quick, before we do the next tip, I want to piggyback on this mono thing. This is like a bonus tip. So yes, when you're balancing in mono and you're trying to decide how loud or quiet or what position to have every instrument in the mix, you should be more effective at doing that when your song is in mono. But there is another thing that skews your ability to balance your song. And I didn't want to make this a separate tip. I wanted to just add it to this mono tip because it's similar. When you are balancing, mixing, and processing your song, do it completely dry. Or in other words, turn off all the reverbs on the track. Reverbs and delays skew your ability to judge how loud or quiet sounds are. Reverbs and delays, they add spaciousness and reflections to sounds. So if you balance and mix and process your song with reverbs and delays on, you'll be a little less effective at making mixing decisions than if you were to balance, process, and mix your song completely dry. Doesn't mean you can't mix your song with the reverbs and stuff already on, but if you turn all that stuff off and you balance your song dry and reference in mono, that is the truest sound that you could get coming out of the DAW. What I like to do is get my song sounding as good as it could possibly sound dry, because then when I make it wet with reverb and add depth, it'll sound really, really good. This next tip is to mix your song by instrument, not section. Mixing is about consistency. When you mix your song by section, you end up with inconsistencies throughout the arrangement because you mixed each section at a different time. When you mix your song by instrument, it's much easier to get a consistent mix from the beginning of your song to the end of your song. Now here's a visual example of what I'm talking about. When you mix your song by section, you likely end up with something that looks like this, where you have a section of your song like the drop that is significantly louder than the verse and the pre-chorus and sections before it. Or like this, where your drop is significantly quieter than the sections before it, like the verse and pre-chorus. Now, having a song that varies in gain from beginning to end is perfectly normal. You can have a song with quiet and loud sections in it, but you want those changes to be more mild. Now, this example here is a closer representation of what you're going for when you're mixing. It's perfectly natural to have a mix that varies in volume throughout the song. Now, here's the workflow that I guarantee you will love it if you try it, so just try it. Group up all the instruments in your song into 4 main categories. That's going to be your vocals or your leads, your drums, your effect sounds, and your melodics. That's going to be your basses, synths, pianos, and chords. Pick one of these groups. I like to start with the drums and then just mute the other instrument groups. And then mix all of the drums. Balance them all, lightly process them all from the beginning of your song to the end of your song. You should be able to press play and every single drum is consistent in volume. No drums stick out as too loud or too quiet. Now that your drums are set, you now have a guideline that you can mix the other instruments into. You can't mess this up. And one by one, you're going to bring each instrument into the drums and you should have a consistent mix from the beginning of your song to the end of your song. I love that workflow and I swear by it. Please try it. All right, here we are at the last tip. This is the best tip of all. I guarantee if you do this, if you leave this video and try this, that your mixes 100% will improve. And that is to use a reference track. The Mixing Engineer's Handbook considers using a reference track to be the best mixing tutor that you could ever have. Hardest question you ask yourself when mixing is this mix done? Does it sound like a good mix? Is it ready to be distributed to streaming platforms? And the only way to really answer that is to compare it against other mixes on streaming platforms. So here's how I use reference tracks. I personally like to use a reference plugin because you can compare and contrast the commercial mix to your song in record speed and you can see every flaw that your track has so easily with a reference plugin. But you don't need one, but I do recommend it. Here's a song that I successfully mixed for a client. He liked it. It sounds good, but I don't know if it's done. And the only way to know if it's done is I have to compare it to similar commercial mixes, and that'll tell me if it's done. I needed to find a similar song to this, so what I did is I took the song In the Name of Love by Martin Garrix. Because it has the same sort of sound in the drop, similar leads, similar chords. And to get the best read on my track, all I do is listen closely and swap back and forth between the original and the reference track. And you can hear every blemish in your song when you do this. So once I get my ears calibrated after listening to the reference song against my song, I'll start picking a certain element. For example, I might pick the snare and see if my snare stands up to the reference snare. When I play back both these songs, let's see if you can hear an issue with my snare versus the reference track. You can't even hear my snare. And then in the reference song, the snare is huge. So that would be a situation where I jump back into my mix, find the snare, and then make it more present in the mix. And then I'll go back and start referencing again and make sure it stands up to the reference track. And there, my snare with that little edit stands up to the reference snare. Then I would run through, make sure I focus on every single element, and once all of my elements stand up to the reference track, it probably means I have a good mix and this mix is ready for delivery. But thanks so much for watching, guys. That's a video for you. If you would like more mixing tips, I did a video like this last year called 10 mixing tips that changed my life. Make sure to check that video out. If you'd like my personal guidance with learning anything about music production, whether it's songwriting, mixing, mastering, arrangement, sound design, you name it, I have a structured step-by-step course program in the description below this video, which also comes with access to my inner circle, where you can share your music with me and also collaborate and share your music with other students as well. If that sounds like something you're interested in, like I said, click the link below, book a call with my team, and let's learn music production together. Stay tuned for next video.